The old wooden house creaked with every step Junho took. Dust danced in the sunbeams that cut through the dim attic, revealing years of forgotten memories. At 25, he'd always been curious about his family's history, but his grandmother had been notoriously tight-lipped about the past. Boxes were stacked everywhere, some covered in thick layers of dust, others looking like they'd been carefully preserved. Junho's fingers brushed against cardboard and wooden containers, each seeming to hold a story waiting to be told. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something pulled him deeper into the attic's mysterious landscape. His grandmother had passed away 2 months ago, leaving behind a house full of secrets. She was a woman of few words, with eyes that sometimes seemed to hold entire universes of untold stories. Junho remembered how she would sit by the window, her hands carefully folding paper cranes, her gaze distant and reflective. A glint caught his eye. Tucked behind a stack of old photo albums, a wooden box seemed to almost whisper his name. It wasn't like the other containers. This one was different. Intricately carved with subtle patterns that looked both traditional and slightly worn, the box seemed to have a story of its own. His heart raced as he carefully pulled it out. The wood was smooth, darkened by years of careful handling. No lock, no complicated mechanism, just a simple lid that seemed to invite curiosity. Junho's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside, a burst of memories waited. A photograph lay on top, slightly yellowed but still clear. A young woman sat, holding a kyageum, a traditional Korean string instrument. Her eyes weren't looking at the camera, but seemed focused on something distant, something only she could see. She wore a classic hanbok, its colors still vibrant despite the years. The woman looked familiar, yet completely strange. Her features reminded Junho of his grandmother, but younger, much younger. There was a strength in her expression, a determination that seemed to jump out of the photograph and fill the entire attic with her presence. Beneath the photograph, a stack of papers caught his attention. Old sheet music, its edges delicate and fragile, seemed to be breathing with decades of untold stories. The musical notes looked complex, unlike anything Junho had seen before. They weren't just musical instructions. They seemed to be carrying a deeper message. He remembered his grandmother's love for music. She would often hum melodies that seemed to come from another time, another world. But she never spoke about where those melodies came from. Now, holding these papers, Junho felt like he was unlocking a part of her life that had been carefully hidden away. The afternoon light was changing, casting long shadows across the attic floor. Dust particles swirled around the photograph, almost like tiny dancers moving to an unheard melody. Junho realized he had been sitting there for hours, lost in this unexpected journey of discovery. His phone buzzed. A message from his cousin Yoonji. They had always been close, sharing a deep curiosity about their family's history. Without hesitation, he snapped a picture of the photograph and sent it to her. "You need to see this," his message read. "I think I've found something incredible." The wooden box felt heavy with history. It wasn't just a container of old papers and a photograph, it was a time capsule. Each item inside seemed to pulse with stories of love, struggle, music, and a past that had been carefully guarded. Junho's mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? Why did his grandmother keep these items hidden? What story did the sheet music tell? The attic, once just a dusty storage space, now felt like a portal to something extraordinary. As the day began to fade, casting a golden glow through the small attic window, Junho knew his life was about to change. This discovery was more than just finding an old photograph. It was the beginning of understanding a family history that had been waiting to be uncovered. The wooden box sat before him, its secrets slowly unraveling, promising a journey that would connect past and present in ways he could never have imagined. Yoonji arrived at her aunt's house within an hour of receiving Junho's message. She was a journalist, always hungry for untold stories, and something in her cousin's tone suggested this was more than just another family artifact. The kitchen smelled of fresh tea and memories. Junho had laid out the wooden box's contents, carefully on the old wooden table their grandmother used for decades. Sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm glow on the mysterious photograph and fragile sheet music. "Tell me everything," Yoonji said, her eyes scanning the photograph. She recognized something in the woman's expression, a resilience that seemed to run in their family's bloodline. Her fingers gently traced the edges of the old photograph, feeling the weight of unspoken history. Junho recounted how he found the box, his excitement barely contained. "It's like grandmother was waiting for the right moment for us to discover this," he whispered. Their grandmother had been a complex woman, loving yet mysterious, warm yet distant. She'd survived the most turbulent periods of Korean history, but rarely spoke about her past. Yoonji pulled out her professional recorder. As a journalist specializing in human interest stories, she knew these personal narratives were precious. "Let's document everything," she said, her professional instinct kicking in. The sheet music was particularly intriguing. The musical notations weren't just standard composition. They seemed to have additional markings, almost like a coded language hidden within the musical notes. Yoonji recognized some traditional Korean musical symbols, but these were different, more complex. "This isn't just music," she murmured, spreading the sheets across the table. Some notes were faded, others surprisingly clear, as if some parts of the story were meant to be remembered while others remained deliberately obscured. Their grandmother's life had always been a puzzle. Born during the Japanese occupation of Korea, she survived the Korean War, raised a family during incredibly challenging times, and yet maintained an almost mysterious silence about her personal experiences. This box felt like a key to understanding her hidden world. Junho brewed more tea, a habit he'd learned from their grandmother. The familiar ritual brought comfort as they delved deeper into this unexpected family mystery. Each sip seemed to connect them with memories of her quiet strength, her unexpressed stories. "Look at this." Yoonji pointed to a small handwritten note tucked behind the photograph. It was written in elegant Korean script, the handwriting delicate yet firm. Though partially faded, they could make out fragments, mentions of music, a performance, something about preservation of cultural heritage. Their conversation flowed like the tea, sometimes quiet, sometimes passionate. They discussed family rumors, trying to connect the dots. Their grandmother had been a talented musician in her youth, but she'd never pursued a professional career. Why? What stopped her? The photograph continued to intrigue them. The woman holding the Kayagam wasn't just posing. She seemed to be communicating something through her intense gaze. Her traditional hanbok, her posture, the way she held the instrument, everything suggested a deeper narrative. As evening approached, casting long shadows across the kitchen, Junho and Yoonji realized they were on the edge of uncovering something significant. This wasn't just about finding an old photograph or some sheet music. This was about understanding a part of their family's history that had been carefully hidden away. "We need to investigate further," Yoonji said, her journalistic instincts fully awakened. "There's a story here that wants to be told." Junho nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and reverence. Their grandmother, who had always been a woman of few words, was finally beginning to speak, through these carefully preserved memories. The wooden box sat between them, no longer just an object, but a bridge connecting past and present. Their journey of discovery had only just begun. The local library's archives felt like a sanctuary of forgotten stories. Yoonji spread the yellowed envelope across the research table, her hands moving carefully to protect the delicate paper. Junho leaned closer, their breath almost synchronized with anticipation. The letter was dated 1953, a critical period in Korean history. The paper itself told a story, slightly worn at the edges, with faint coffee-like stains that suggested years of careful preservation. Each fold seemed deliberate, each crease holding a secret. "This handwriting," Yoonji whispered, "it's not just writing. It's almost like art." The Korean script was beautifully crafted, each character formed with precision and emotion. Words seemed to dance across the page, telling a story beyond mere text. Slowly, carefully, they began translating. The letter wasn't a typical communication. It spoke of music as a form of resistance, of cultural preservation during a time when Korean identity was under immense pressure. Fragments of historical context emerged, references to performances that were more than just musical events. The writer, someone signed only with initials, described a musical group that used traditional instruments as a way of keeping Korean cultural heritage alive. They weren't just musicians, they were cultural warriors fighting through melody and rhythm. Junho's hands trembled slightly. "This sounds like something grandmother would have been part of," he said. Their grandmother had always been quietly proud of her cultural roots, teaching them traditional songs and stories that seemed to carry deeper meanings. Certain passages were particularly intriguing. Coded language suggested a network of musicians and artists who were documenting history through their art. Between the lines, they could read stories of resistance, of preservation, of hope during incredibly challenging times. The letter mentioned a specific performance, a secret concert held in a small village during the most difficult years of the Korean War. Musicians had gathered, risking everything to play traditional music that connected them to their roots. It was an act of cultural survival. Unji, with her journalist's trained eye, noticed something unusual. Certain words were subtly underlined, not consistently, but in a pattern that suggested a hidden message. Was this a form of secret communication? They spent hours at the library, cross-referencing historical records, musical archives, trying to understand the context. The letter was more than a personal document. It was a piece of living history. Our grandmother was part of something much bigger, Junho realized. The quiet woman who spent her days making paper cranes and humming soft melodies had a past far more complex than they had ever imagined. The afternoon light changed, casting long shadows across the research table. Other library visitors came and went, but Junho and Yoonji remained focused, completely absorbed in their discovery. Each translation revealed another layer. The letter spoke of music as a form of healing, of resistance, of maintaining cultural identity during a time of immense national trauma. These weren't just musicians, they were guardians of cultural memory. Specific passages described how traditional instruments like the kayagyeom were more than musical tools. They were vessels of story, of resistance, of collective memory. Each note played was a statement of survival, of refusing to be silenced. By the time the library was preparing to close, Junho and Yoonji had transformed their understanding of their family history. The letter wasn't just a document, it was a bridge connecting generations, a testament to the power of art and cultural preservation. "We need to find out more," Yoonji said, her voice a mixture of excitement and reverence. Junho nodded, understanding that their journey of discovery was far from over. The letter seemed to pulse with unspoken stories waiting to be fully understood. Their grandmother's silence now made sense. Some stories are too powerful, too painful to be easily shared. As they carefully packed the documents, both felt they were carrying something precious. Not just paper and ink, but the living, breathing history of their family and their nation. The office of Professor Kim was unlike any academic space Junho and Yoonji had ever seen. Walls covered with vintage photographs, traditional instruments hanging like precious artifacts, and stacks of books that seemed to breathe with historical knowledge. Professor Kim was a renowned historian specializing in post-war Korean cultural movements. In her late 60s, she had sharp eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. When Yoonji spread out the photographs and letter, the professor's demeanor changed instantly. "Where did you find these?" she asked, her voice a mixture of excitement and controlled professional interest. Junho explained their discovery, watching as Professor Kim examined each document with microscopic attention. The kayagyeom photograph caught her special attention. Her fingers traced the musician's posture, the way she held the instrument. "This isn't just a random performance photo," she murmured. "This is documentation of a critical cultural moment." Professor Kim began connecting dots they hadn't even recognized. The letter, the photograph, the sheet music, they were pieces of a larger narrative about musical resistance during one of Korea's most challenging periods. Musicians weren't just performers. They were cultural preservationists. During the 1950s, traditional music was under significant threat, she explained. Many cultural practices were being suppressed, forgotten. These musicians were creating a living archive, preserving our cultural identity through melody and rhythm. The research took an unexpected turn. The musical group mentioned in the letter wasn't just a local ensemble. They were part of a broader underground network of artists and musicians who used their art as a form of quiet resistance. Yoonji recorded everything, her journalistic instincts in full gear. Each revelation felt like uncovering a hidden treasure, a piece of history that had been waiting to be understood. Professor Kim pulled out some archived documents, showing connections between musical performances and cultural preservation movements. The kyageum, a traditional Korean string instrument, wasn't just a musical tool. It was a symbol of cultural resilience. Your grandmother, she told them looking directly at Junho, was likely part of a generation that understood music as a form of survival. Not just artistic expression, but a way of maintaining cultural memory. The research revealed layers of complexity. These musicians operated in a delicate space, creating art while navigating political tensions, preserving culture while avoiding direct confrontation with authorities. Specific details emerged about secret performances, hidden musical gatherings where traditional instruments became voices of collective memory. They weren't just playing music, they were telling stories that couldn't be spoken openly. Junho felt a profound connection to his grandmother. The quiet woman who seemed so reserved now appeared as a complex, courageous individual who had lived through extraordinary times. Professor Kim shared historical contexts they had never understood. How music became a silent language of resistance, how melodies carried memories, how traditional instruments became vessels of cultural preservation. The sheet music they discovered wasn't just a musical composition, it was a coded narrative, a way of documenting experiences that couldn't be directly expressed through words. Each note carried layers of meaning, each rhythm a statement of cultural identity. Your family's story, Professor Kim said, looking at them intently, is part of a larger national narrative of survival and resilience. As afternoon light filtered through the office windows, Junho and Yoonji realized their discovery was far more significant than a simple family mystery. They were uncovering a hidden chapter of Korean cultural history. The photographs, the letter, the sheet music, they were no longer just personal artifacts. They had become historical documents, testament to a generation's quiet courage. We need to document everything, Yoonji said, her voice filled with determination. Junho nodded, understanding that their journey of discovery was about preserving a legacy. Professor Kim smiled, a rare, warm expression that suggested she saw in them the same spirit of preservation that had driven the musicians of previous generations. Their family's story was transforming from a personal mystery into a broader narrative of cultural resilience, musical resistance, and the power of preserving identity through art. The small concert hall felt charged with anticipation. Soft evening light filtered through stained glass windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden stage. Junho's hands trembled as he carefully placed the original sheet music on the music stand. Weeks of research, conversations with Professor Kim, and endless discussions with Yoonji had led to this moment. They had discovered that the mysterious musical composition was more than just notes on a page. It was a hidden story waiting to be told. A group of traditional musicians gathered around, their instruments gleaming, kyageum, daegeum, and other traditional Korean instruments that seemed to breathe with historical significance. Each musician had been carefully selected, not just for their musical skill but for their understanding of cultural preservation. Yoonji sat in the front row, her professional recorder ready. This wasn't just a performance, it was a historical reconstruction, a tribute to their grandmother and the musicians who had risked everything to preserve their cultural identity. As the first notes began to play, something magical happened. The music wasn't just sound, it was a narrative. Each melody seemed to carry whispers of resistance, memories of difficult times, hope that had survived against incredible odds. The sheet music revealed its secrets slowly, Hidden between traditional musical notations were subtle markings, almost like a coded language. Professor Kim had helped them decode these subtle signs, understanding that the composition was both a musical piece and a historical document. Junho closed his eyes, remembering his grandmother. The quiet woman who had hummed these melodies, who had preserved these documents, who had carried these stories silently for decades. Now, finally, her story was being told. The musicians played with an intensity that went beyond technical skill. They understood they were performing more than music. They were recreating a piece of living history. Each note felt like a connection to the past, a bridge between generations. Unexpected moments of emotion swept through the audience. Some older attendees wiped away tears, recognizing melodies that spoke to collective memory. The music transcended simple performance. It was a form of historical testimony. Research had revealed that the composition was created during a time of significant cultural suppression. The musicians who originally performed it had done so at great personal risk, using music as a form of quiet resistance. As the performance reached its climax, something extraordinary happened. The coded messages within the musical composition became clear, a narrative of survival, of cultural preservation, of hope during impossible times. Yoonji's journalistic instincts were in full gear. She recognized this wasn't just a musical performance. It was a historical document being brought to life. Each note told a story of resilience, of maintaining cultural identity against tremendous challenges. The final movements of the composition were particularly powerful. They seemed to capture the journey of an entire generation: struggle, resistance, survival, and ultimately hope. The music spoke of things that could not be easily expressed in words. When the last note faded, there was a moment of profound silence. Then, spontaneous applause broke out. Not just appreciation for musical skill, but recognition of something deeper, more meaningful. Professor Kim, sitting in the audience, nodded with a knowing smile. The research, the careful reconstruction, the understanding of historical context, everything had led to this moment of revelation. Junho felt a connection to his grandmother that went beyond personal memory. He understood now why she had kept these documents safe, why she had protected these stories. Some narratives are too precious, too powerful to be carelessly shared. As the audience filed out, conversations buzzed with excitement. They had witnessed more than a performance. They had experienced a piece of living history, a musical narrative that spoke of survival and cultural resilience. The wooden box that had started their journey sat quietly backstage, no longer just a container of old documents, but a vessel of historical memory, a bridge connecting past and present. Their grandmother's silence now made sense. Some stories are better told through music, through careful preservation, through the subtle art of remembering. As night fell, Junho and Yoonji looked at each other, understanding that their journey of discovery was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning.